It is college football playoff rankings week. Tennessee is not going to make the playoff this year, but would they if there were a 12-team playoff? And what about next year once the 12-team playoff arrives? Welcome into the Volunteer State. I'm Blake Toppmeyer with the Knoxville News Sentinel's Adams Sparks and John Adams. Tennessee coming off of a very important win over Kentucky on Saturday. Guys, as I teased in the open there, I do want to talk big picture, long-term type of stuff with the playoff going from 4 to 12 next year, how that might affect Tennessee. But before we get there, I don't want to gloss over this result in Lexington because I thought it was huge. It won't go down as Josh Heupel's best victory, and I don't know that it counts as his most important victory because Alabama still looms large in that conversation. But it's on the short list of his most important wins, I think, throughout his 2.5 seasons in Knoxville. Paul Feinbaum said that game saved Tennessee's season, and I don't know that that's hyperbole. I think I would buy that. That was how big that win was, I thought, for Tennessee against Kentucky on Saturday. How did you guys see it?
Yeah, I think that was a game at this point in the season, like the top half, maybe even the top third of the SEC is separating itself, and the games that you're getting in late October and now will be early November, you're sort of shedding the dead weight of that race. Nothing against Kentucky, but they at one point were in that conversation, and now they're dead weight. They're pushed aside. Tennessee held on and are moving forward. And like you said, we'll talk later in this pod about teams that are on the edge of playoffs that are in the at least in the conversation for the better bowls. If Tennessee had lost that game, they would be out of that conversation. The fact that they won it, they're back in. And it we'll see this more in November, that Tennessee coaches always need to beat Kentucky and Vanderbilt, and in this era, Missouri. We'll see if that happens. And Josh Heupel has done that so far. And so to do that again sort of upholds the idea that not just Tennessee's team is better than Kentucky this year or those other teams, but its program is better. And he needed to make that statement, and he needed to win on the road because they just the road woes had been sort of a little bit of a frustration, but it was turning into a real trend, a real concern. It's one thing to lose on the road at Georgia a couple of years ago. It's another, and then lose at Alabama. It's quite another when you lose at South Carolina, and then if you lost this one, you would have a loss at Kentucky, so on and so forth. So they needed to beat a team that was, at their level on the road, and they did that. And the way they did it, and I wrote this after the game, was sort of by any means necessary. It wasn't the script or the formula that we thought we'd get out of this Tennessee team this year. They're running the ball really well. Joe Milton was really efficient. They didn't get the pass rush that you thought for sure they would have. Instead, they got carved up by the pass, but they still stopped the run, and they made a bunch of field goals. And however you can win, you win. And a lot of teams at this time of year are following their formula, and it's not working. Tennessee found a new formula, and that's what separated them from teams like Kentucky.
Yeah, that's one of the things that impressed me too. I thought Tennessee was very resourceful in that game. The other thing that impressed me was that I thought Tennessee beat Kentucky at Kentucky's very best. In this series, it has long been dominated by Tennessee. How many times has Kentucky done everything it can to just roll over and hand Tennessee a win? It didn't do that Saturday. This was the best I've seen Kentucky play. I know it had the big win over Florida, but Florida wasn't playing well then. I just think Kentucky's passing game, I never saw that coming. Devin Leary passed for about 370 yards. He looked like what he was supposed to be when he transferred from NC State, a future NFL high-round draft pick, and he made NFL-like throws. Kentucky has good receivers, playmakers, but they haven't been making plays. They've leaned totally on the running of Ray Davis. Leary had been a 54% completion guy. And I didn't attribute Kentucky's success to Tennessee failures. I thought this was a case of where Kentucky really upped its game. And for Tennessee to win that game, I thought was very significant.
John, I think that was the perspective of Kentucky fans too. Something I like to do sometimes for road games is listen to podcasts of media that covers the opposing team just to get their perspective. And so I was listening to a few Kentucky podcasts on the drive home on Sunday, and they all kind of said the same thing, that they couldn't really be that. This is more fan reporting, fan sites, I'll say. That they couldn't really be that disappointed in Kentucky's performance because they played well. They played really well. They played poorly against Georgia, poorly against Missouri, but they were pretty pleased that Kentucky did everything that they could do. They played well. They just got beat by a better team. And so, I think that says a lot about Tennessee, that they played a Kentucky team at its best and still won the game on the road. By the way, those same podcasts, and these again are fans responding, but some media, their second take on the game was Kentucky may have won the game if the officials would have helped them out some, because obviously they helped Tennessee. So I thought that was funny. Fans need to listen to the opposition sometimes to hear their perspective, because all that I heard after the game was how much Tennessee had gotten screwed out of some calls. And when we asked Josh Heupel about it, he again refused to answer anything. He was so angry. So it goes both ways. Kentucky thought all the calls went Tennessee's way, and vice versa.
Yeah, if you want to find the one way to unify America, just bring up officiating, and folks from far and wide will come to an agreement that the men in the striped jerseys stink. Now they will disagree about how they stink, but they'll be in unison about officiating stinking. That's for sure.
They usually, Blake, excuse me, they usually agree on the announcers too. The announcers are always against their team.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you could tell if you just listened to them. I knew right away they were pulling for the other team.
Yeah, usually your local sports columnist too is out to get you as well. All right, so full disclosure here, we're recording this on a Monday afternoon. You are listening to this after that. We're recording this before the college football playoff rankings are out. That's fine, because Tennessee's not making a 4-team playoff. They're more contending for something like a Florida Bowl game, which is what Adam has been saying for weeks, and looks like it might be coming to fruition. So this is more in the 10,000-foot view conversation. Next year, Tennessee should go into the season among a list of teams that could conceivably make a 12-team playoff. Adam, I know you've written some this week about some of the young talent on Tennessee, some of the guys that are coming back next year, some signs that we're seeing that maybe there's really some reason for optimism going forward about what Tennessee could achieve in 2024. So I know it's a long way out, but like this time next year, what do you think the chances are that we're going to be talking about Tennessee in the playoff conversation after the first rankings come out for a 12-team playoff versus a 4-team playoff?
Well, it depends on how much they can reboot this roster, and I think this is a good week to talk about it since Tennessee's playing UConn. They should win in a blowout, and we'll see a lot of these young players play. So Nico at quarterback next year, presumably, can he make this offense do at the very least what it's doing this year, and maybe closer to what it did last year? How many of those offensive linemen are going to return? Some of them have a COVID exempt year; they could come back if they wanted to. How many offensive linemen will they get in the portal? Some of the defensive linemen, which are really, really good, can come back. They have a COVID year. How many of those will be back? Will they be able to restock the secondary because they've only played veteran players there? Will they go into the portal and get at least one dominant wide receiver? They have a 5-star wide receiver coming in. They need at least one guy in the portal. How will they restock tight ends, because they'll lose a couple of those? There's so many questions. And by the way, if Tennessee fans shouldn't be scared of all these potential holes, because this is what teams all around the country are doing. You just don't restock through recruiting in the way that you used to. You've got to go into the portal and get a lot of guys. I like generally what Tennessee has coming back. I like the recruiting class that they have coming in. We'll see some of the freshmen that are in this class this year we think, in the UConn game. Nico is the one that everybody wants to see, but I think they have some promising guys on defense. I think when the 12-team playoff comes, we're going to sort of need to be reconditioned on how we look at seasons. Like right now, for an SEC fan, particularly a Tennessee fan, you say you can lose one. You can lose one and you can still be in it. And, that was the situation last year. Once Tennessee lost to Georgia, he said, well, they're still in it. They can still get in the playoff. And once they lost to South Carolina, okay, now you're probably out, and they were. We'll have to recondition ourselves next year into thinking more of this as not 11-1, but 10-2. A 10-2 SEC team is most likely going to get into the playoff in the 12-team playoff. A 9-3 maybe could, but I certainly wouldn't put down any bets for that. I think 10-2 is going to be the mark. I think one way to think about this is right now we have the 2 playoff games, and then we have 4 additional bowls that make up the New Year's Six. If you're 10-2 now, you go to a New Year's Six bowl. Last year, Tennessee went to the Orange Bowl. If Tennessee somehow won out, which would include an upset of Georgia this year, they would be 10-2. They would be in the conversation they'd be right in the middle of it for a New Year's Six bowl. The probably not the Peach, probably the Cotton Bowl. But again, that's a 10-2 team. That's how you need to think of next year's game, because you're talking about 12 teams in both of those scenarios, or really 11 and a group of 5 team. So if you're good enough to get into a New Year's Six bowl in our current format, you're good enough to get in the playoff in next year's format. And, then it just comes down to how much you have coming back, what your trajectory is, and what your schedule looks like. And I think that last one is going to be as important as anything with Tennessee. Next year, they'll play NC State in the second game of the year. It's a neutral site game. Well, Nico, let's say he's the quarterback. Will he be ready by the second game of the year to beat NC State? I don't know. He can't be a developmental guy and go on the road and win. Next year, the 3 big ones, if you're judging it by what the rankings are now: at Oklahoma, at Georgia, at home against Alabama. You can't lose all 3 of those and get to the playoff next year. At Oklahoma, at Georgia, and at home against Alabama. You got to go at least 1-2 in those, and then run the rest of the table. So it's going to be a major lift, especially with Oklahoma and Texas coming into the conference. But 10-2 next year, that's your mark. Tennessee has rarely hit that in the last 20 years. They did last year. They're actually still in contention to do it this year. So it at least could be on the table next year. But if you're in rebuilding and you're an 8-4 type team next year, you're probably out of the conversation by this point in the calendar.
Yeah, I think it's all about the transfer portal with Tennessee. Tennessee's got to do better in the transfer portal than it's done in the past. It's got to get some really productive players. It needs offensive linemen. It needs secondary players. It's really hard for me to predict, try to project what the lineup will look like. But this COVID year just throws everything askew. So I have a hard time ascertaining, what will this depth chart look like? But I agree with Adam. There are promising young players out there. Some of them are playing more than others now. But when I look at that schedule, I think it's a very manageable schedule, because I think Tennessee right now, I expect Tennessee to be favored in 9 games next year. 9 games. I don't know exactly what NC State will have, but NC State's kind of a mid-level ACC team, maybe a little better than that. It had a nice win this past weekend. I think it's 5-3, but I see it as a winning team, but not necessarily a top 25 team. Then the 3 games you mentioned, Georgia, Alabama, Oklahoma, if you just win one of those games and do what you're supposed to do, take care of business in the other games, I think you're in the playoff. And I could even see, depending on how things go elsewhere, a 9-3 SEC team against a really good schedule and maybe have a good non-conference win, better than an NC State would be. I could see a 9-3 team from the SEC slipping into the playoff. I don't know. Do we know yet what's going to happen? The Pac-12's gone. So, Blake, can you help me with that?
Yeah, that I don't think that's reached a conclusion, but there's certainly been a lot of dialogue, and the SEC is partially behind that about reducing from 6 automatic bids for conference champions to 5 automatic bids, which would free up an extra at large, which a conference like the SEC wants to see happen. I don't believe that has reached a conclusion at this point, but that is the ongoing debate, and certainly the SEC is behind the idea of reducing the number of automatic bids by 1 to make them eligible for an additional at-large bid.
Yeah, and it would be fair if you did reduce it by 1, because what you're going to possibly end up having is you have the Power 4, so to speak, conference champions in, and then you're going to have 2 more conference champions that are from essentially the group of 5. So let's say the AAC gets somebody in, their champion. Well, then for that last spot, you're going to give like the Mountain West champion the spot, as opposed to the second best Big Ten team or the second best ACC team, which, let's say it's Clemson, or the third or fourth best SEC team. Can you imagine if you're a 9-3 SEC team and you lose to 3 top 10 teams, and you're not going, but the Mountain West Conference champion is going?
Well, this is a popular take, and an unpopular take, but that Mountain West champ this year is probably going to be 13-0 Air Force. So yeah. I would be arguing for 13-0 Air Force
this year. Okay, but
9-3 SEC.
They would be that this year, though. But then you would have that conversation with the AAC champion, or the Sun Belt. And I love mid majors because I've cut my teeth covering mid majors group of 5s, but 1 spot is enough. You shouldn't have 2 in there. But yes, and with Texas and Oklahoma coming into the conference, that opens the door for more teams from the SEC potentially coming in. But I think you have to go into the year saying 10-2 you're in, 9-3 you're out. I think that's probably where the cutoff is going to be. And really, that's I said before, we can sort of kind of compare that to where things are at this year. Tennessee this year, best case scenario, if they ran the table, like I said, they could get into a New Year's Six bowl. So that's what you think of this year as a playoff caliber team. But they could go 9-3 or even 10-2 and make the Citrus Bowl, which is not a New Year's Six game. They're in contention with that with probably Ole Miss and LSU. So if this was a 12-team playoff year, it would be Ole Miss would be picked to get in to the 12-team playoff. LSU would be just on the outside, and then Tennessee would be after that. And so you would be in November, you'd say, hey, it's 3 teams playing for 1 spot. And that's sort of what they're playing for like the Citrus or the Cotton Bowl at this point. Next year, it would be for a playoff spot.
Yeah, hope's going to spring eternal for a lot of programs on like November 1st next year, because only 12 teams will make the playoff. But at this point in the calendar, there's going to be like 25 teams in the conversation for it. But what I'm curious to see, and we won't know it till it happens, is let's say Tennessee were to go to 9-3 this year. They lose to Georgia, they beat Missouri, they go to the Citrus Bowl, and they beat a pretty decent team in the Citrus Bowl. They're 10-3. I think most Tennessee fans are probably feeling pretty good about that. They're wondering about the one that got away in Alabama. They're wondering how they lost to Florida in the Swamp, but still 10-3, you win the Citrus Bowl. Most of your fan base is feeling good. Alternatively to that, there is going to be a year where a 9-3 SEC team makes the playoff. It's going to happen at some point. I don't know if Tennessee's a great candidate for it next year, because to John's point, you might have to beat someone better than NC State to have a great resume at 9-3, but it's going to happen somewhere. I'm wondering if you're the number 12 seed in a 12-team playoff at 9-3, and you get steamrolled in a first-round game, you lose by 20 points, how are you feeling as a fan base versus if you go 10-3 with a Citrus Bowl win? Like, on the one hand, you made the playoff, but you lost your last game of the season and it's over. On the other hand, you don't make the playoff. You don't even make a New Year's Six, but you win the Citrus Bowl. It is going to be interesting to see how fans feel about seasons if you barely squeak into the playoff and then get run over versus making a decent bowl game that you could win.
I asked a similar question to a Tennessee fan in my household a few days ago, where I said, I think it was in the conversation of Michigan's alleged sign stealing. And I said, Tennessee won the Orange Bowl last year. It's a great way to finish. 11-2, won the Orange Bowl. Would you have rather had that or gone into the playoff and lost to TCU? And so you got in the playoff, but you lost your last game. Of course, the response was, well, Tennessee wouldn't have lost to TCU.
Sure.
So that wasn't an option. That wasn't the scenario I was laying out. But I think it's going to be similar to, the question is asked over the years, would you rather be the NIT champion or get into the NCAA tournament and get put out? And usually people would say, I'd rather be in the tournament. There's a cutoff. If you get in this group, you're one of the best. If you're not, you're not. And I think that's how people are going to look at it. Getting into the playoff is going to mean something. And it's really going to, for a number of programs, it's going to hold coaches' feet to the fire, I think, a little more aggressively. And that's hard to think of how aggressively their feet are held to the fire now in some cases. But there's going to be 12 spots now. If you're a premier program and you don't get in the playoff, then there's something wrong with the program, and we got to change coaches. That's how people are going to look at it. Back in the day, you could sort of wave the banner and say, hey, we still got into a pretty good bowl and you can't win them all, sort of thing. But now you don't have to win them all, and you can get into 12. And we'll see a graphic 3 years from now. We'll see a graphic that says, best coaches not to go to the playoff, or the so-and-so's playoff drought now to 3 years.
I really think if you don't make the play,
and by the way, that'll be for Josh Heupel too. If I know everybody's high on Josh Heupel now, and I think they have every reason to be, but if next year's team goes 8-4 and rebuilding, okay, that's fine. Freshman quarter, or at that point, redshirt freshman or sophomore quarterback, that's fine. Second year, if you don't get to the playoff, well, what's wrong? There's 12 spots. Why haven't you gotten there? Third year, you're not in the playoff. This isn't working. There's so many playoff spots. How come you can't get in? You just got to be one of the top 12. That'll happen in a lot of schools, and that'll happen at Tennessee if Tennessee doesn't get in there in the first, couple 3 years.
I don't think it'll happen. I don't think it'll take that long for the fan base to turn. I think if Tennessee doesn't make the playoff next year, I don't care if they got a new quarterback. The fans are going to say, well, you should have played him more his freshman year. I think there will be tremendous pressure on Tennessee to make the playoff, a 12-team playoff.
1 year, John. You're saying 1 year.
Next year, yeah. I think there will be pressure on Tennessee to make the playoff.
Because it's Heupel's fourth season. It'd be different if he was a first-year coach. It's the first year of the playoff, but it'll be Heupel's year 4.
Yeah, see, Tennessee, this is a long time buildup of frustration with Tennessee fans. I mean, you go back how bad Tennessee's been at so many times since 2007, starting with the 2008 season. Tennessee hasn't won an SEC championship since 1998. And I think that factors into it. Now they see a better program, a better coach, better players. Okay, we're tired of waiting, and we don't want to hear about need more time. The time is now. Let's do this. You went 11-2 in your second year. You should be better in your fourth year. I think that's how a lot of fans will look at it. So I don't think they will have much wiggle room here. I think it's going to be, if Tennessee goes 8-4 next year and it's not in the playoff, I think the majority of the fans will be very disappointed.
Well, I can. I don't mean to be a negative Nancy here, but I can, John. I can tie your take there with an earlier topic we hit in this pod. Is that next year, it being Josh Heupel's fourth year, it will be the first season that the majority of his players are in the starting lineup. This year, it's a little over 50% of his players that he brought here. He still has like 40-something% of Jeremy Pruitt players or recruits. But the majority of the starters right now, by just a little bit, is still Jeremy Pruitt players, especially on defense. Almost the whole defense is Jeremy Pruitt players. So next year would be the first year that you say, hey, these are all guys, almost all guys that Josh Heupel handpicked. So if it took a step back and you didn't make the playoff, or you weren't even in the conversation of the playoff, that would be the take that I think the fan base would have. Again, they're probably going to be pretty good next year, but if they weren't, that's where people will take it. That this is now the turnover of his players, including the quarterback that he chose.
And, let me frame it. Go ahead, John.
Well, I was just thinking also another factor in this, couple of things. Josh Heupel's now making $9 million a year. And fans look at that. Those are championship wages, or playoff wages, I should say. And something else that might come up is that when he was at Central Florida, the record declined while he was there from his first season to his last. And so they could see that as a trend. I think these were, you know how it is. If you're trying to make a point, you go looking for those facts that support your point. And I think that's what would happen with some fans.
Well, let me frame it differently, guys, because, I mean, if you're a program like Georgia with Kirby Smart as your coach, or probably Alabama still falls in this conversation, maybe one or two others, you're going to make a 12-team playoff, if not every year, like 9 times in a 10-year span. Probably, like, I mean, they make the playoff almost every year now in a 4-team playoff, particularly with Alabama. It's been a regular in the playoff. You know, last year was an exception to the rule. Certainly, there's going to be a couple programs that become staples in a 12-teamer, but for most programs, that's not going to be the case. There's a lot of programs that can probably make it like once or twice every 10 years. There's other programs that can maybe make it, you know, between like 3 and 6 times every 10 years. I'm wondering what you think a realistic expectation for Tennessee could be across a 10-year span. How many times? I mean, very few coaches are going to get 10 years, right? I'm not saying with the same coach, but just in a 10-year span, how many times should Tennessee reasonably expect to be in the playoffs during that stretch? I mean, yeah, Vols fans would love to be in the same category as Georgia with Kirby and say, hey, we'd make the playoff every year. That's not going to happen. So what is reasonable to expect to happen in a 10-year span? How many times does Tennessee need to get in it?
Well, I think our answers and Tennessee fans' answers would be different, even reasonable Tennessee fans, because you have to think about where this program has been, not just recently, but that it was a championship level for a good period of time. I did something, I think it was last summer maybe, where I looked at past Tennessee teams and how many would have made the playoff if you had a 12-team playoff in place. Of the last 40 years, 13 Tennessee teams would have made a 12-team playoff. Johnny Majors would have had 4 of those. Phil Fulmer would have had 8 of those, basically all the 90s, in some early 2000s. And then Josh Heupel would have had 1 last year. So 13 times in 40 years. So you're talking about at least 1 every 3 years, 1 every 4 years. I mean, if you're doing that math, then you would say out of 10 years, they do it, 3 times? I think that's a kind of a heavy lift to do that. 2 out of 10. I think 1 out of 5, 2 out of 10. I think that's what you're looking at to be reasonable. If it's 1 out of 10, I think you've got a problem with the program. If it's better than 2 out of 10, you're headed in the right direction. But I think 2 out of 10, 1 out of 5 would be fine. I don't think Tennessee fans would be happy at all with getting there twice or even 3 times in 10 years. I think they would want it to be an every other year type thing. You didn't make it this year? Okay, well, you got to make it next year. I think that's how most Tennessee teams would see it.
All right, so Adams in for 2 out of 10. John? I know yours is going to be higher than 2.
Well, maybe I'm speaking like a fan here, but I would say 4 out of 10.
That's the number I had in mind, was 4 out of 10. And I think you got to do something with one of those. You can't make it 4 times in a 10-year span and lose in the first round every time. Rick Barnes can lose in the first and second round every year, and nobody cares because Tennessee, although it's a quote unquote everything school, it is still foremost a football school. And so I think Tennessee has to make it about 4 times in a 10-year span. I think you could maybe get away with 3 times in a 10-year span
Let me up
if
mine
you're
to
doing something.
Let me up mine to 3. I'll go 3.
Okay.
And here's why. I'm thinking through what we said earlier in the pod about can you get there at 10-2? You absolutely will. If you're 9-3, could you get in? Maybe. I think Tennessee could consistently be a 9-3 program. So I think they could. I think they could get in 3 of the next 10. I think that would be reasonable. I think it also, the math is going to change a lot when Oklahoma and Texas get in, and then the Pac-12 goes away or whatever is going to happen with it. Because I think you're going to get an extra SEC team in that we didn't think would happen before. You're talking about like 3 teams in the SEC getting in. The math is probably going to change where you're going to get 4 in at least. And Tennessee can be in the top 3 or 4, every 3 years.
I think when you look at the expanded SEC and you start talking about expectations, Alabama and Georgia, you say, well, they should make it most of the time. If you told Alabama and Georgia fans, well, you'll make the playoff every other year, they'll wonder what's gone wrong. I think LSU is another program where the fans will expect to be in there more often than not. Not just 5 out of 10, but maybe 7 out of 10. In Oklahoma, my goodness, they're going to expect to be in there 7 out of 10 times, I guarantee you. And Texas fans might too. So I've listed 5 schools other than Tennessee whose expectations will be high. One thing that could help Tennessee in all those programs, you already expanded this thing to 12. I could see it going to 16.
That's a good point, John. I frame this from a 10-year lens. That's assuming the 12-team playoff even lasts 10 years. It'll be 10 years on the nose for the 4-team playoff. This is the 10th and final year for it. It'll be interesting to see how many years the 12-teamer lasts. Does it even make it to 10 before it expands again? You might be onto something there, John.
Well, and I'm curious to see whether it's a 12 or 16 for Tennessee, which group they're in. Are they going to be in the group that's contending almost every year? Because that's sort of what they are these last 2 years. They're in that 9 to 11 win range. Or are they going to be a team that's just not going to make it, and then they pop every 3 or 4 years? I think in the SEC, like John was listing off those teams that expect to go almost every year. Georgia and Alabama for sure. Texas, yes. Oklahoma, yes. LSU, yeah, they're going to expect that. Florida, what is Florida? I mean, we don't know who the head coach is going to be, but long term.
We don't think it'll be Billy Napier, though.
But, does will Florida expect to be there most years, or will they say we're going to build to try to get there in a 3-year span? And so I don't know if Tennessee is going to be you can be in the conversation every year and get over the top like you would have last year, or is it more building for that shot? Because like a South Carolina, Mississippi State, who knows, maybe Ole Miss. I mean, those type of schools, if you think the last decade, remember that year when Mississippi State and Ole Miss were both like number 1 and number 2 in the in the country? They built to that, and that was like the dream season. Hey, we got to the mountaintop that one time. Is Tennessee going to be closer to that or closer to the Alabamas and Georgias where they're going to be in the conversation? It just matters what happens in a couple of games. I don't really know which one they're going to be in, but I could see them being in either. They're very much in that middle ground.
Well, see, we've mentioned 6 schools, including Tennessee, and we're saying, Blake and I said 4 out of 10 for Tennessee. Now you bring up Florida. I think Florida fans they see what's happening now as an aberration. They think their rightful place is where Urban Meyer had the Gators and where Steve Spurrier had the Gators. Florida, Auburn, and Texas A&M I mean, you think Texas A&M, those fans, gosh, with all their resources, there just could be a lot of teams vying for these playoff spots.
Yeah, and again, if you're thinking, well, every year we should be in it, every year you're going to have one team that pops that year. This year it would have been like Missouri. Hey, this is their one chance. So you're going to have one of those every year. That's probably going to eliminate one of the ones that figure they for sure should be in. So it's going to be fun. But yeah, I'm 3 out of 10 for Tennessee. But if Josh Heupel only goes to the playoff once in his first 3 years, they're probably going to run him out of town. I don't think they should, but you never know.
Well, there is a game on Saturday. It is a noon kickoff, so you can get the mimosas and Bloody Marys. You have to get them flowing early if that is your pregame of choice. Adam will not be partaking in that because he'll be hard at work in the press box at Neyland Stadium. You can find his coverage at knoxnews.com. Find John's commentary. And as always, we will be back with you next week. Thanks for listening to the Volunteer State.